Hi, this is Lainey Cameron, and I am here today with Ashley. Hey, Ashley.
Hi, everyone. Hi.
So, Ashley and I are going to tag team this wonderful episode, which is going to feature 6 of the most exciting debuts coming in the first half of 2022. And we are so dang jazzed about this. And let me just show you who we are going to have on stage. We have 6 folks, like I said, who are joining us. Maggie Giles, the author of The Things We Lost. We have Melanie Mitzner, who is going to talk about Slow Reveal. We have Jamerry Rendquist, who's going to talk about All I'm Asking. Shauna Robinson is going to talk about Must Love Books. Lisa Rowe, Welcome to the Neighborhood. And Sandra L. Young, Divine Vintage. And what a lineup. It just spans genres. It doesn't span genres. They're all women's fiction, but spans types of women's fiction within that. So I'm so dang excited. And our first section here is going to be with 3 awesome authors, Melanie, Jamerry Rendquist, and Maggie. So let's start by say hi, everybody.
Hey.
Hi.
Hi.
So let's start with Maggie. I would love to hear a little bit more about The Things We Lost. For those who haven't had a chance to read it yet, tell us more about your debut novel.
I would love to. Thank you so much for having me. So The Things We Lost follows Maddie Butler, a 36-year-old mother of 2 in a lonely marriage. She's been haunted by guilt for 14 years ever since the mysterious death of a university friend named Gina. While drowning in her own unhappiness and guilt, Maddie actually enters a foolish affair that she immediately regrets. So when she decides to come clean, that night her distant husband unfortunately does not return home. And when she goes to bed, she asks herself a careless question of what if I had never met him? The next morning, she wakes up 26 years old again in a completely different past. Her best friend hates her. Her close relationship with her brother is strained. Her husband and children are nowhere to be found. And strangest of all, Gina is still alive 4 years after when her funeral should have been. As Maddie navigates this new world, she realizes she is the product of her own unhappiness and begins to wonder if this new do-over is exactly what she needs, even if it means never seeing her daughters again.
And I had a chance to read this one, and it's a page turner. Like, this thing had me hooked from the very beginning. I love the idea of like sliding doors, right? Like the idea of like, what if we woke up one day and our reality just wasn't the one we were in yesterday? I thought it was such an interesting premise, and you did so much with it. Really interesting.
Thank you.
It's a great book. So let's ask Melanie, and there are so many things about this book that I am fascinated by. I haven't yet had a chance to read this one, but I want to because it sounds so interesting. Why don't you tell us a little bit more about it, Melanie?
It's actually on pre-order. It's not really launching until May 3rd. It's a novel that's set in 1990s New York, and it's about a family of artists who question the arbiters of culture and defy social norms. In an open marriage, Catherine, a film editor, meets Naomi, a lesbian poet, and a decade into their on-off affair, Catherine's struggling to maintain both relationships. So despite her husband's struggle with sobriety and abandoning his art career for advertising, she decides to try and reconcile her marriage, even though her love for the poet prevails. Then an unexpected tragedy strikes and their lives are upended. That's basically what it's about.
And one of the things that got me particularly interested in this book is it's from, I'm not going to say the publisher right. Do I say Inanna? Is that how I pronounce it? Or Inanna, which is the same publisher that published Lisa Braxton's debut, which was a fabulous debut. And so I know they publish really great quality books. And so I'm excited to read yours as well. And third of ours, let's pass it off to Jamerry Rendquist to tell us about another one. It's a fun read, All I'm Asking.
Great. Thanks for having me also. All I'm Asking is a story about a friendship between 2 women, Naomi and Jasmine. Naomi is an online teacher who lives in Minnesota, and she works with kids, high school students who are in an alternative setting, which means they're students who have not necessarily had a lot of success in the traditional classroom. And her friend Jasmine, who is living in Washington State, and she is a department store manager. And because of that distance between them and the time difference, that's actually why they communicate mostly through email and text. And so the story is actually in what we call an epistolary format, which means it's narrated in a series of emails, texts, forum posts, and similar media. But because also that it's a friendship story, you can probably guess there's a rift that happens between the two of them. And part of those stressors are that Jasmine, her friend in Washington, her wife, trips and falls and breaks her arm. And it seems like it's a straightforward injury, but it's not. It's leading to some symptoms that doctors cannot diagnose what's going on with her. And it's putting a lot of strain on her relationship and with their little family unit because they have 2 young children. Naomi is super hyper involved with her students, and it gets to the point where she is just so wrapped up with them, and she even takes one in who is a pregnant teenager and takes one into her home, that she's sort of missing some other signals going on with her own family and with her friends. And so our story is trying to figure out, what is it that truly causes them to break apart in the friendship, and what is it that's going to get that bond back together again.
And I also had a chance to read this one. And what's so interesting to me is this epistolary, how do you say epistolary format, where it's all communications. So it's a new version of it, right? Because it's all emails and online forums, etc. But you did it so well. It's very hard to pull off, right? To get someone pulled into the characters and totally engaged with the characters. It's really difficult. And so for a debut novelist to take that on, bravo. It is not easy to do that. And you did it so well. And I was totally into the characters and rooting for them and wanted it to work out the right way. And I also particularly loved the theme of kind of the main character overextending herself. Like I can kind of relate to that, taking on a little too much. And then the other people in your life start to suffer because you're kind of taking on more than you're capable of. Yeah, exactly. And so I thought you did it really well. So let's move to one of my favorite questions, the inspiration behind novels. We've got 3 very different books here. And I am interested in that little gem of like, what started you down this path? And let's go back to Maggie. Like, goodness, what gave you this idea of sliding doors, alternate reality? Where did all this come from?
My own life, to be totally honest, I had just gotten out of a very long-term relationship that had really defined my early 20s. And I found myself very lost and confused and was having my own what if questions and where would I be if I'd made another choice, or, who would I be a completely different person? So I actually started writing this novel as a bit of a therapeutic project that ended up morphing into this kind of relatable story about this character who gets to see her own what if play out.
What a cool concept. I really enjoyed the concept of like, what if, and I love the fact that it begins with this affair, right? Because if ever there's a moment that makes you say, what if, right? What if I hadn't done that? That's a perfect thing to pick, because I imagine everybody after an affair is like, shit, what if I hadn't done that? How would life be different? So, okay, let's pass it off to Melanie. And I am interested, this is such an art-centric book, right? There's a lot of like artistic elements to it. So like, is that coming from your own life? Tell us more about that art angle and kind of where the inspiration came from.
It is actually from my own life, and my partner's a visual artist, and I'm a writer. So that's very much a part of our lives. But, a couple of things. I'm very fascinated by family dynamics, and pretty much everything I've ever written has to do with that. So I find them very complex. There's hierarchies within families. There are certain situations, there's relational situations that people play out in their other relationships throughout their life. And so that's a part of it. But what the artistic part is, I really wanted to draw a parallel between building intimacy and trust in relationships and embarking on the artistic process, because both are very risky, messy, and unpredictable. And I felt that there was very much a relationship between the two. So that's why I chose to make them artists and to explore. There's very much about the artistic process in this. It's not just about artists. And I compounded that by the fact that you can't dictate who you fall in love with. So in this case, it was probably a good thing that she had the affair, maybe. It's reckless and crazy, but and the other aspect is I lived in New York from the 80s through the middle of the 90s, and in the East Village and Tribeca, and it left a permanent imprint on me. So I wanted to reflect on this and capture the zeitgeist of New York in the early 90s.
That sounds fabulous. And Janet, I'm intrigued. I'm going to kind of give you a two-parter on this one. The inspiration for this novel, but also this really unusual choice to do it all through communications. I'm really interested in like what led to that as part of your inspiration for the book.
Well, it comes actually a little bit from real life. I have a really good friend of mine. We actually became friends online and started as we got to know each other. We passed, and then we still do this. We pass each other. We just kind of inform each other of our lives just through emails. We have these long emails, and then we reply and to all the different parts. And it kept going back and forth. And I kind of kept all those, and I threw them into a little folder that I called the friendship files. And because eventually I thought, you know what? I bet you there's some kind of story in here. And whereas the two women in my book, Naomi and Jasmine, are definitely not us. I mean, a little bit of me if Naomi, because I do teach, and used to teach online. So a lot of my stories about my students are coming from that. But I guess I thought, well, because that's how we communicated, it seems like that'd be kind of a fun way to tell the story. And then a part of me was thinking, well, okay, what if I did everything and that there was no pullback into just regular prose, narrative prose? Can I actually convey a story and characterization doing all these different things? And so I really had to think about different ways to pull some of that in. So we have forum posts because she's part of an online book club. And so we have some of that kind of stuff going on. There are some interspersed text messages. And there's stuff behind the scenes that we don't actually see going on that kind of come through in those messages, but maybe we don't see everything. And can be a challenge too. But I think that's kind of realistic. We don't need to see everything that goes on.
Yeah, and I've heard it said that by giving yourself a constraint, I don't know if you've ever seen these creative constraints where they ask you to do something like write a paragraph that only has words with the letter S, or write 6 paragraphs in a row that start with the letter S or T or whatever. But by setting ourselves constraints, it can actually spark more creativity, is the theory. And so I find this fascinating. I'm in awe of what you did, and portraying an entire novel that way. It's hard, and you did it really well. So congratulations.
Well, it was also really fun.
It's also really fun.
I mean, making up news articles is a blast, or making up student responses to essay questions and things like that. Very, very fun.
And there's even a book club in there, right? With online discussion of different books at various points. So let's transition to, I know it's one of the favorite questions from our listeners, is writing advice. And you've all made it to the point where you've got these great debuts coming out. And so I'm interested in what you would share with other people who perhaps aren't there yet, perhaps want to have a debut novel come out, about what you've learned along the way on your path. And I'll switch it up and I'll go to Melanie first this time. Let's do that.
I know this is going to sound really simple, and it's something you can do without an advanced degree, without a mentor, without a lot of training, and that's just show up. You really have to put in the time and energy and do it consistently, and you're going to see your work improve vastly if you do that. And I usually start my day with a poem or a journal entry where I get my creative juices flowing. I read for stimulation, but I don't limit, how I'm working at that point. But that way, it sort of loosens me up. And then, as far as a novel or short fiction, I write freely until a character or situation compels me. And then I do bios several generations back of the main characters so that I can construct a history that really helps me shape the story. And it informs how it evolves. I'm very character driven, as you might have expected. And the main thing that I try to do is give my characters enough latitude to come alive and speak to me rather than me dictate who they are and what they want. Because if you can manage that, it's much more authentic.
That's great. Great advice. And I'm going to pass it off to Janet next. What do you have to say to the next generation of folks who want to do this?
Well, I like the whole just show up because, as a teacher in my past, and one of the things I used to teach was English. And I always used to talk about writing begets writing, reading begets better reading. So the more you write, the better you're going to get at it. And so you just have to keep doing that. But my first thing of advice is really the reading part. I think you need to be a reader in order to be able to tell a story. You need to know how stories are told. So sometimes I run into people saying, well, I don't really read, but they're trying to write a novel. And I'm thinking, I'm not saying it's not possible, but I think if you want to, get the best possible chance of having a story that's going to work, you need to have that breadth of reading. But the other little thing I'm going to say too is there's just no one way to write a book. There's so much advice out there, such a plethora of things, and so you need to find those things that work for you in order to do that. So just kind of remember that you can choose the way that works best for you.
I agree. I'm a big believer in don't get so wound up in the rules that you can't use your creativity and create something. And, rules are sometimes helpful, but sometimes they're the opposite of helpful when you're trying to be creative, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, Maggie, what about you? What do you have to say to us?
So I totally love both of those answers. Studying your craft, I think, is huge. The people that succeed in this industry do so by perseverance. My other piece of advice is find your community that can support you on your down days, help you navigate those plot holes, and commiserate on those rejections. For a solitary hobby, this community makes a big difference. It's a lot of how you're going to learn, and it's a lot of where your support is going to come as you navigate this treacherous industry that we've all joined.
Isn't that the truth?
Yeah.
And here, I'm just going to flash up on screen quickly each of your books if folks who are watching the video want to check that out. Just a reminder that we put all of the links to everybody's books on the webpage. So you'll find the links to all of these authors, their social media, and their books at www.bestofwomensfiction.com. And this is a good moment for me to pass it off and invite Ashley. Ashley, why don't you take it from here?
Thanks, Lainey. I am so excited to introduce you to our next 3 guests. We have Lisa Rowe, author of Welcome to the Neighborhood, Shauna Robinson, author of Must Love Books, and Sandra L. Young, author of Divine Vintage. So thank you all for joining me.
Thank you, Ashley.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Of course, the main purpose of this podcast is to let our listeners know about the best of women's fiction. So let's start by each of you telling us about your debut novel. Lisa, we'll start with you.
Sure. My book is called Welcome to the Neighborhood. It's the story of a woman named Jenny Miller, who is a struggling artist and a single mom living in Queens with her 11-year-old daughter, who finds out that a second chance at love also brings her an opportunity to maybe give her daughter everything that she never could, kind of struggling and working in Queens. So what happens is she meets a really sweet guy named Jeff, and Jeff asks her if she will move into the house that he lives in an upscale neighborhood in New Jersey. And while she normally doesn't really care about, upscale things or material things, she does think it's a great school system. There's a lot of kids on the street, and it'll be able to give Harry everything she never could. And then she meets the neighbors, and she is suddenly thrown into this mix of CEO PTA moms and Real Housewife wannabes and mean girls. And she and Harry find that they have to sort of battle them all in order to sort of maintain their own identity and their own authenticity, and to see really if they're going to fit in on the street or not. And that's kind of the story.
Thank you, Lisa. Sandra, will you tell us about your book?
Well, thank you. Divine Vintage is a mixed genre book, and it's got elements of women's fiction as well as social justice issues. And when Tess Burton relocates, she's risking her inheritance to open the Divine Vintage boutique. And when she wears an Edwardian trousseau gown, she channels a century-old crime of passion. Now, she sees it differently than history is passed on. So she has to convince the skeptical yet handsome descendant of the accused murderer to help her try to untangle the mystery. They use the catalyst of vintage clothing and the murdered woman's diaries to see back into the past. And they discover that pursuing love in 1913 was just as thorny as modern day. And as the list of murder suspects rises, they are their own emotions are tangled up with those of the past, and it may just tear them apart.
Thank you, Sandra. And Shauna, tell us about your book.
Sure, I'd love to. So, my novel Must Love Books is a contemporary women's fiction novel about an editorial assistant named Nora who has been working at the same publishing company for the last 5 years in the same role. And in that time, she's realized that dream jobs are a lie. She, went into publishing as a book lover, and she thought that she would be going out to lunch with her favorite authors and working on the next great American novel when in reality, the only books her division publishes are boring business books for CEOs that really have nothing to do with her. And all her favorite coworkers keep getting laid off or leaving, and her mental health just keeps getting worse. And so when Nora's salary is cut by 15%, when she can barely afford to pay rent as it is, she secretly takes a second job with a competing publisher. And as she's balancing these two jobs and trying to keep either of her bosses from finding out, and really just looking for a light at the end of the tunnel because she wants to leave publishing and doesn't know what to do with her life, but now she has two publishing jobs. She ends up falling for Andrew Santos, who's a best-selling author that either publisher would be eager to sign. And so that sends Nora into quite a moral quandary as she really struggles with her mental health and is still trying to figure out what to do with her life as she's in her 20s and just really feeling lost.
Thank you, Shauna. I love the variety of novels that we have. New neighborhoods, new jobs, old clothes, really something for everyone. I always find it fascinating to hear about the initial spark of inspiration that authors get that ultimately leads them to write a book. So I want to know what inspired each of your novels. Sandra, can we start with you?
Oh, absolutely. Of course, vintage clothing, as you can tell behind me, is a large focus because I have a huge collection. It fills a small bedroom, and I gathered that over several decades of performing in community theater. The love of vintage clothing grew. But I've also realized that the book is really, too, gratitude for the county I live in. I based it in the largest city here in Northwest Indiana, and that's where I really found my niche in performing. And also I was able as a nonprofit manager to work with a lot of great people to improve our quality of life. So all of that is rolled into this book. And thankfully readers, because it's out, debuted on the 21st, are really loving it with all of these different genres and plot lines going on, including a homeless plot line. So I drew from a lot of the things in my own life to weave this together.
Sandra, I don't know that I realized you were based in Indiana. I used to teach fashion history at Indiana University. Did we connect over that?
We did very long ago. Absolutely. I knew you were a fashionista, so that's exciting. You can tell, yes, I wear vintage a lot, especially in my persona with the Divine Vintage release.
Oh, I love that. Lisa, will you tell us the inspiration behind your novel?
Sure. So my novel was inspired by the fact that I moved around a lot when I was a kid, and even in, a lot of my adult life. And I kept having to start over and move into these sort of pre-existing social circles and kind of sometimes wedge my way in, and sometimes put myself into a place where I might not really have belonged. And so I wanted to take the concept of starting over and a new beginning and flip it on its head a little bit and kind of look at it with, what if you moved into a place that was completely going on without you and wanted you to fit into it exactly as they had always, been? And how does that affect you? Do you change yourself? Do you change the way you dress? Do you change the way you talk? Do you change your values to fit in with the people that you're now with? Or do you stand up for yourself? And do you stand up for your authenticity? And what are the consequences of that? So in my story, it is about both a mom and her daughter who are both fitting into or trying to fit into these social circles that may not be the right place for them. And that is the decision that, the mom in particular, because the daughter is young, is going to have to make as the book progresses, and you'll find out whether she did or she didn't as it goes on. And Sandra, I just want to say that my book does have a bit of vintage clothing in it because my character spends a lot of time in thrift stores. So it's not exactly vintage. Some of, so that kind of it interests me. So I will definitely be reading your book. I love the concept of the vintage.
Well, thank you. Yours is on my TBR too, and Shauna as well.
And Shauna, will you tell us the inspiration behind your novel?
Yeah, in a biographical fact that I'm sure will surprise no one, I used to work in publishing. And as someone who, grew up loving books and majored in English and figured, okay, well, I'm working in publishing and this is what I will do for the rest of my life. It was a startling discovery to get there and realize that it wasn't really what I expected, and also to go through a lot of layoffs that took all my favorite people away from me. And so um, when I came up with the idea for Must Love Books, I was just feeling really lost in my career, and I kind of wanted an imaginary friend. I wanted to read a book about someone who felt as lost as I did. So I really wanted Must Love Books to center on this character of Nora and her exploration as she comes to terms with the fact that this career she'd been working towards isn't for her, and then tries to figure out what her next steps are, and tries to figure out what her next dream job is, because that was something I was still struggling with. And so I wanted a friend in my struggles too.
Oh gosh, I absolutely love that. I can completely relate. I'm sort of between careers as well, which is a great transition to my next question. Since I am an author who's not yet published, I'm always eager to hear the advice that other writers have to give. And as debut authors, you have such a unique perspective. You author those of us who are not yet published inspiration that we may get there too. So I want to hear the advice that you have for other authors who want to be where you are now. So Shauna, can we start with you?
Absolutely. For me, I think the biggest thing is consistency, because when I was writing Must Love Books, it took me years because I kept putting it down because I didn't think anything would ever amount to it. And it wasn't until I think 1 month when I decided to try to participate in NaNoWriMo, where you try to write 50,000 words in the month of November, that I wrote half the book. And it was just that act of writing every single day at a set time. And I think logging my word count really helped too. I would track it in an Excel spreadsheet, and there was a lot of motivation in seeing those numbers climb every single day. So even if you feel like you're not going anywhere, you still have that something that can track progress, and that can be an Excel sheet, or it can be stickers and a planner. Anything that you can do to track your consistency and just keep at it even when you feel like you don't know what you're doing will get you to the finish line.
Oh my gosh, I think that feeling of nothing will come of this is so relatable. I experience that multiple times a day, probably. I kind of go up and down all the time. So that is excellent advice. Thank you. Sandra, let's go to you next.
Well, I would say, and Ashley, you've got a great start on this already. Have that presence already established on social media, that you're out there, you're connecting with people, you are building real relationships, not only with local friends and acquaintances, but also with the Bookstagram community on Instagram. And I was behind the curve because, like Shauna, this book, was around for quite a few years of being worked on, and kind of took me by surprise when it came out. So I had to scramble and in less than a year put together a website around vintage clothing, and got on Instagram, really beefed up my even Facebook presence, and some Twitter too, because I just didn't have that. And I realized that if I had been building those relationships, the connections are everything. Women's fiction writers has been wonderful. Already had those connections beginning. And so we've tapped into the 22 debuts. We help and support each other. I just say, really be thinking far ahead and have that, conviction that you will make it and that you are ready when your book is hitting the launch.
Of course, as a book blogger, bookstagrammer, now book podcaster, I adamantly second that advice. Thank you. Lisa, what about you? What advice do you have for writers?
Sure. Okay. So my advice is going to sound a little bit like a bumper sticker, but bear with me. My advice is to be brave. And what I mean by that is that every step along the way that we write, there's an opportunity to let fear get you, to let self-doubt get you, and to let, the sort of outside world get to you. I mean, from the day you write something down on your first piece of paper, you have to be brave in order to get that honest, even if it's funny, it's still honest and, or emotional thing down. To let somebody read your story is hard and scary. To let someone give you back feedback is scary. And so my advice to everybody is, every time along the way when you feel like I just don't want to do this, or I just can't do it, or I can't do it anymore, just do it. Just take the one step. Just as Susan Jeffries says, which I love, I just love this, feel the fear and just do it anyway, because it's only going to hurt for a second to just make that one extra effort and put yourself out there again, write that next page, finish that story, send your book to someone and hear their criticism or their critique. And it happens to us all along the way. I mean, we are very close. You guys, the other authors, have their books on a shelf, but I'm very close to having my book on a shelf. And still every day, there are things that I'm really afraid to do. This podcast was one of them. So, just step past your feeling, be brave, and just do it. That's my advice. And bumper sticker.
Lisa, if you have those bumper sticker made, I will be the first one to sign up for one.
I will send you one.
One more time, I want to show those who are viewing the video of this podcast each of your books. Again, we have Welcome to the Neighborhood, Must Love Books, and Divine Vintage. And a big thank you to all of the authors who joined us for this special episode featuring debut authors. I appreciate you all. Again, I'll show everyone who participated. And as a reminder, we put all of the links to everyone's books on the webpage. You can find their websites and social media links there too. So visit us at www.bestofwomensfiction.com. Thanks again, everyone.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. It was fun.
Yeah, it was great.